Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Point, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, education, business, whatever gets our attention. My name is Jesse Mayshark. I am co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. I am joined on this dreary, misty, chilly February morning by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing, Scott?
Oh, I'm doing great. We're getting ready to, early voting's getting ready to start. So the election's coming up. It's getting exciting.
Didn't we just have an election?
We did, but that was in the city.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. They just come around.
They do.
Well, I want to, before we go further into this podcast, I want to take a point of personal privilege and say happy anniversary to my wife, Casey Fox. Today is 10 years since we got married. It's been a great decade. And, you know, I think 10 years is the podcast anniversary. I think that's where the gift is. You give somebody a shout out on a podcast. So I just want to say happy anniversary, Casey. You know, nothing says love like a Knoxville politics podcast, don't you think?
Well, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
To you and to Casey. And I think you might want to get a backup gift.
Really?
Just saying.
Huh. Okay. I appreciate the
just a suggestion.
Maybe some flowers or chocolate or something. Okay, well, we do have a fair amount of stuff to talk about this week. Of course, we do have elections coming up, as you noted, Scott, and we will be talking about a couple of those races. More interesting political news this week. State Representative Gloria Johnson somewhat surprising people by saying she is going to run for 2 offices at once. There was discussion of school vouchers, both in Governor Billy's budget and right here at home with the Knox County School Board. And to start us all off, thought we would talk just a little bit about the Advance Knox planning process, proposed changes to the county's growth policy plan. We have talked about this on the podcast before, and of course we have written a lot about this at CompassKnox.com, which you can go and read if you are a subscriber. And if you're not a subscriber, great opportunity to do that. But there was a public meeting this past Monday. County Commission had an information session on these proposed changes to the county's growth plan, and then the other kind of big pieces of the Advance Knox process, especially this comprehensive land use plan and transportation plan that is going to accompany the changes in the growth policy plan. Not going to go into all of the details and all of that because we've talked about it before, and again, you can find that at our website. What was interesting to me, Scott, about this meeting with county commissioners, and all of a couple of them showed up late, but I do want to note that all 11 county commissioners came out for this meeting at 2:00 in the afternoon on a Monday. It can be hard to get a full quotient of any of our political bodies at that time of day, and so shout out to County Commission for showing up, taking it seriously, listening, and asking a fair number of questions. But what was interesting to me was that overall, I would say the tone and tenor of the conversation was pretty favorable to the changes that County Mayor Glenn Jacobs wants to make, which, among other things, would convert about 14 and a half square miles of currently designated rural area into what they call planned growth area, which would allow for more kinds of development and denser development in some of the so far or less developed parts of the county. And, as we had talked about in the past on this, there has been a fair amount of community opposition and skepticism about this plan, a lot of concern about losing prime agricultural land, concern about roads and schools and other county infrastructure being sufficient to handle the kind of growth that these changes would allow and would contemplate. But even with all of that, most county commissioners who spoke about this at Monday's meeting, and of course they're going to have a couple of votes in the coming months on all of this, so nothing has been done yet. But the overall tone of the conversation was generally favorable, thanking Jacobs and his administration for taking the lead on this. Pretty much everybody agrees that the county's plans need to be updated because they haven't done this in 20 years, and a lot has happened in Knox County over the past 20 years. And of course, this plan was looking forward another 20 years, so taking it all the way to 2045. And I'm sure, Scott, that as these subsequent votes come, and we're going to have votes at County Commission this month, City Council, Town of Farragut, I think, are both supposed to consider the growth plan changes in March, and then that comprehensive land use plan is going to go through Planning Commission, and then it'll come to County Commission. So lots of subsequent votes to come here, and those will probably be attended by a lot of the people who have been coming out to the meetings raising questions and concerns so far. And we all know what can happen when you get a room full of angry people. Like, you can't take any vote for granted. But I did think it was interesting that at the moment it looked and sounded to me like there's a lot of support on County Commission for this.
Yeah, and I think that I don't know about the Farragut Board of Mayor and Aldermen because we don't really cover them very often, but I think the City Council will probably take some cues from that, because this does mostly affect the land outside the city limits or the town limits in Farragut. So, and it's significant that especially if it's a large majority of commissioners support the plan when they vote on it, and and apparently the administration, the Jacobs administration, is listening somewhat to some of these concerns. One of the things you mentioned, the comprehensive land use and transportation plan. We talked about that last week, and because Planning Commission last week, the Planning Commission was going to vote on it. The county requested that they hold off on it, and this comprehensive land use plan is a little bit more detailed than the growth policy plan.
Right. It's filling in some of the details,
filling in some coloring some of the spots, and the county actually asked to postpone the Planning Commission's consideration of this because they were going to take a lot of the public input that they've had and see if they might make changes to it. Mm-hmm. So, while we do know that votes will be coming, it can be a little bit fluid.
Right. Right. Some of those, especially that comprehensive plan, can still change. The growth policy plan, basically the amendment that's been proposed, they can't change at this point because of the way that process is spelled out in state law, because it's come through the coordinating committee that they had and so forth. But yes, definitely on those details. And then the one thing that was made clear at this county commission meeting this week is that once we get through all of that, the changes in the growth policy plan, adopting a new comprehensive land use and transportation plan, then there's still a whole other layer to come here, which is then applying and implementing all of that in the county's zoning ordinance. And that is likely to be so this Advance Knox process has been basically a 2-year process at this point. There's going to be another 18 months or so of developing what they're calling a unified development ordinance, which will update the zoning ordinance and also bring together all of the different parts of county code that affect and regulate growth and development and so forth. And so that is still to come. So, if you're a planning geek, which I know there's some of you out there, and no shade implied by that phrase. I respect our planning geeks. Scott and I are planning geeks ourselves. But if you're the kind of person who pays a lot of attention to land use issues and development and growth issues, you're in prime position right now, because we're going to have all of this discussion and these votes in the next few months, and then still another 18 months to 2 years of unified development ordinance talk past that. So you can just book your schedule for the next couple of years. You can have all the conversation about planning and growth that you want. That doesn't mean that any of these decisions are going to go the way that any particular person or, community group wants them to go. But these are we talk about this stuff a lot. I know it can be super boring. People tend to not pay a lot of attention to these kinds of things right up until somebody's trying to build something next to them. And then they want to go back and say, who allowed this to happen? But this is where that's happening right now. The decisions being made here. This is a 20-year plan that they're making. And it's supposed to be updated at various points along the way. But what's going on right now really is going to have a lot of effect on life throughout the county, and especially, as you say, in the unincorporated areas, because that's the only parts of the county that all of this really directly affects. The city of Knoxville and town of Farragut have their own planning apparatuses and ordinances and everything. But as we have talked about here before, growth anywhere in the county affects everyone in the county, because all of that growth is going to be using the same roads and the same schools and the same restaurants, all of the things that we all use. And so all of this is pretty important to our life here in Knoxville and Knox County. So we will be talking more about all of that. I think the next stop for all of this, as I said, at this month's county commission meeting, they are going to be taking the first crack at voting on the changes to the growth policy plan. All right, let's turn our attention to school vouchers. And this has been much in the news in recent months, will continue to be much in the news for the next several months at least, as the legislature considers Governor Bill Lee's proposal. But Scott, you watched Lee's budget address this past week, and as expected, vouchers were kind of a centerpiece of it, right?
Absolutely. His proposal is to provide $141.5 million for just for the vouchers. He tried to cushion a little bit by talking about providing $261 million more for the standard school funding. TISA.
And, I'm a little irritated by this. We still don't have a consistent pronunciation of TISA. TISA stands for the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement Act, which is the new state funding formula. But I still hear people. I asked when this passed a year ago, are we going to call this TISA? Are we going to call it TISA? Are we going to call it TISA? I don't hear anybody saying TISA, but I hear people saying TISA and TISA. And let's get our act together here, people.
Well, regardless of how we pronounce it, it's going to get a boost in funding from the governor's budget. But the vouchers are the big thing. It's going to be the big argument will be over vouchers, and I think a lot of you don't know how legislators, especially legislators in other parts of the state, are going to respond to their school boards, who are going to pretty much be uniformly opposed to this. And so you don't know their relationships with their school boards. A lot of especially in more rural counties, you see these people a lot more often than you might in Knox County or Hamilton County or Davidson County. I mean, these people truly are the people you see at the grocery store. So,
And in a lot of those smaller counties, the school systems are among the, if not the largest employers. And so people take, those representatives take that very seriously.
Yeah. So we'll see how that goes there. I know here the school board has been divided over this.
Yes, and they continued that divide this week. So the same night that Lee was giving his budget address this past Monday, the Knox County School Board had its monthly work session, and there was a resolution on the agenda proposed by board member Jennifer Owen, who has been a staunch and very determined opponent of school vouchers the entire time she's been on the board. And, it's interesting, when she first came on the board in 2016, and she's running for re-election this year for a third term, that was a essentially unanimous or close to it position on the school board. The Knox County School Board for years and years and years was opposed to vouchers and had that as part of their standard, legislative agenda every year, asking the legislature not to create school voucher programs or fund them and so forth. But that started to shift, especially as we moved to a partisan school board. We have a 5-member Republican majority on the board, and that majority has been increasingly open to the idea of various kinds of school choice. And our current board chair, Betsy Henderson, and vice chair Steve Triplett both ran as candidates saying they supported school choice and would support vouchers and charter schools and so forth. And so no surprises from them that they continue to hold that position. And after some discussion, both at Monday's work session and then at Thursday's voting meeting, where they actually voted on the resolution, it was a 4-4 tie with the 4 Republicans on the board at the moment against the resolution, and the 2 Democrats and 2 independents on the board voting in favor of it. Again, at the moment, that is only a 4-member Republican block because, as we talked about in recent weeks, school board member Mike McMillan recently passed away, and so there's a vacancy on the board right now, which County Commission will be moving to fill in the next month or two. But for now, that leaves the board politically divided in a partisan sense, and that very much showed up in this vote. And, I think one thing that the biggest, well, there's a lot of unknowns about this right now, including what exactly it's going to look like. There was a draft of the bill that leaked a couple of weeks ago and then got hastily pulled. It was put online briefly and then got pulled down. But of course, lots of people got to read it in the interim, and it has been written about. As of that point, that draft, and we'll see an actual bill proposed on this in the near future. There were essentially no accountability measures in it. And that's one concern that a lot of people have raised about this, is that you're talking about using taxpayer money that would go mostly to private schools. People can also use it for homeschooling, but the biggest impact of this is likely to be people using these state vouchers, currently proposed to be about $7,100 a year to enroll their kids in private schools. But that money, it appears, would just go to those private schools with basically no strings attached, which makes it extremely unusual as far as public education funding goes, because as we have talked about a lot, our public schools are subject to a great deal of very specific and granular accountability and transparency in terms of how their students are performing. They're mandated to give all of these state tests. They're mandated to report those scores in various ways. The state has started assigning letter grades to schools and school districts based on how their students perform on those things. There are a ton of requirements, regulations, and evaluations built into our public school system, all predicated on the idea that we are spending public taxpayer money on this education system. And so we want to know whether it's doing what we want it to do, which is educate our children and, create the next generation of civic leaders and so on and so forth. All of the things we look to public education to do. But so far, Bill Lee has really stuck steadfastly by this idea that we don't need to do a single bit of that when it comes to handing over taxpayer money to private schools. There's going to be a lot of talk about that, and I'm sure there will be legislators, both Democrats and Republicans, who push for some kind of accountability. Like, this would be not unusual only for education funding, Scott. This is unusual for public funding, period. Like, we have, if you get a $2,000 grant from the city of Knoxville, you have to provide fairly extensive documentation on what it's used for, how, exactly where it went, all of that. And so to create this whole category of what could end up being, right now it's budgeted at $141 million because they're for the first year they're saying this will only be available to 20,000 students. But in the second year, the idea is that it would be available to anyone in the state who wants it, depending on how much money the legislature decides to actually commit to it year to year. But theoretically, you could eventually be looking at not just hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars in public funding. And it's just interesting to me because I cover education and have for years, and very familiar with all of the discussions and debates about how you measure things and hold teachers accountable and principals accountable and schools accountable, hold parents accountable for, student absences, all of just this giant infrastructure of accountability around our public education spending. But we're talking about essentially creating a whole category of what could be, education is the largest item in the state budget, and we're going to theoretically carve out larger and larger chunks of that and just wall it off from oversight and accountability and just say that, oh, well, parents know best. Well, I mean, why does that apply to church schools that, might be teaching that evolution is false and any number of other things, but not to public schools. So I don't know. We will see. There's going to be a lot of talk about all of that, and a lot of those issues around accountability were raised at the school board this week. But Steve Triplett, who, as I said, supports vouchers and voted against Owen's resolution, he kind of said, this whole resolution being proposed, this is just politics, this is just political, and he kind of thought it wasn't necessarily worth the school board's time to be debating it since it's a state decision. But and Daniel Watson, an independent board member who voted for the resolution, kind of pushed back on that and said, well, yeah, it's political. Every bit of this is political. We like to say that we're not politicians, but come on, we're school board members. We all ran for office, and now it's a partisan school board. Of course it's political, and the opposition to Owen's resolution was every bit as political as the support for it, basically.
Yeah, and as you said, it's kind of silly to say it's not political anymore, especially with the partisan school board. But yeah, I think the accountability, the absence of accountability in this is another thing that could give a lot of Republican lawmakers pause. And
Republican lawmakers not typically in favor of handing out big checks to people with no strings attached.
Yeah, I mean, the push to put strings onto public assistance for people
for people who are receiving like $200 a month.
Yeah, that the insistence on putting strings attaching strings to those measures typically comes from Republican lawmakers. And you're right about the city grants. I mean, they almost every grant that they provide, they monitor, they review, they make sure that the organization is spending the money the way that they said they were going to spend the money when they asked for it. It is a little hard to believe that you would spend $141 million and who knows how much in the future without having any accountability at all about how it's going to be spent.
Yeah, and I think the problem for Lee there is that he very much wants this program to be available for parents to send their kids to private schools, and a lot of private schools are probably happy to receive that voucher funding, but those private schools do not want that level of scrutiny and accountability. That's part of the whole point of being a private school.
Yeah. I mean, if they wanted that level of accountability, they just say, well, we'll just send our kids to public schools. So.
Right, or create a charter school, because charter schools are subject to all. Charter schools are treated like regular public schools for the purposes of accountability. The charter schools have to meet all of those standards, which has always been an argument in favor of them by people who favor charter schools, saying it's okay, we're still holding them accountable. And now suddenly, like magically, we're going to create a whole unaccountable part of the state budget. So again, we will see. One other point I just want to make about that, because you will hear people say things like, well, we're just letting parents decide where to spend their money. That is not true. That is not what's happening. This is not the parents' money. First of all, I don't think many residents of Tennessee probably pay $7,000 a year in state taxes, because most of our taxes are sales taxes, and there are not that many. I mean, I'm sure there are some households spending $7,000 in sales taxes a year, but not that many. This is tax money that comes from all of us. This is our tax money. This is public money. It's not money that, these individual parents are paying into the state, and now the state is just saying, no, you can use your money somewhere else. You're letting them, parents who do this, you're letting them use our money. They're not using their money. They're using our money. And I think that is an important distinction to make as this discussion goes on. This is everybody's money. It's not just theirs. All right. So now let's talk about Gloria Johnson.
Talking about politics.
Yeah. Speaking of politics, so you covered when Johnson declared for Senate back in September. You covered that, right? And that was a pretty big deal. She did kind of the statewide rollout of her Senate campaign.
Yeah. She was kind of riding a huge momentum of popularity, stemming from the Tennessee 3 incident last legislative session. She had become overnight kind of a national figure, at least nationally. People around the nation had heard of her, and so she decided to take that and use that as a platform to run against Marsha Blackburn for the U.S. Senate seat. I think the assumption was made that she would run, and if elected, she's definitely would be the underdog if she gets a Democratic nomination and goes on to face Blackburn. But if she did win, that she'd just resign her seat, so somebody else would run for her seat.
Mm-hmm. Right. In making that announcement, she never explicitly said that she wasn't going to seek re-election to her state house seat, but she didn't say that she was, and I think there was a general assumption probably that she wouldn't run for both of those seats at the same time. Well, you know what they say about assumptions.
Well, yeah, and one thing is, because the assumption was she was going to be running for the Senate seat, and she wouldn't be campaigning for her state house seat. City Council member Seema Singh announced that she would run for the 90th district seat.
As the Democratic candidate.
As the Democratic candidate, and so she had already publicly announced that. She was, I think she'd started raising money. It was pretty much going to, and she would have been a formidable opponent for candidate for that seat, and
still may be, because so there's a lot of interesting things that happened this past week. Gloria Johnson did come out and say that yes, she was in fact going to seek re-election to her state house seat while also continuing her Senate campaign. So that was the first thing that happened. And of course, we talked to her and asked her the questions that a lot of people, I think, immediately had. The first one being, well, do you think this undermines the Senate campaign? if it looks like you're kind of hedging your bets by running for 2 seats at the same time. And she said, no, she really doesn't think so. The same issues, the issues she's talking about in her Senate campaign are the exact same issues she's been talking about the whole time she's been in the legislature. Her platform is the same regardless. And she wants to serve the people of Tennessee in whatever capacity she's able to. And so she doesn't see it as any kind of conflict that, really those two campaigns can in many ways overlap, although of course one of them is entirely just within Knox County and the other one is across the whole state. But Singh then quickly said that she was suspending her campaign. She doesn't want to run she doesn't want to challenge Johnson in a primary. She said she wants to her primary concern is keeping that 90th district seat in Democratic hands, which the odds of that are fairly good based on the last election. It's a fairly Democratic leaning district. But she endorsed Johnson and said, yes, I'm right there supporting her. But she also said that, she is still ready and able to run if and when that seat becomes open. So theoretically, let's say if Johnson happened to score a significant upset and beat Blackburn and be elected to the Senate, then, she couldn't hold both of those offices at the same time. She would have to decide. And I think everybody assumes that, yes, if you win a Senate seat, you would probably take that over a state legislative seat. And that then there would be a special election for the legislative seat. And Seema Singh said that, well, then she would run for that in that circumstance. The other wrinkle, though, that is going on at the same time as all of this is there is a bill in the legislature sponsored by two Knox County Republicans, State Senator Richard Briggs and State Representative Dave Wright, that would make it illegal, impossible for anybody to run for two offices at the same time on the same ballot. Some exceptions there, like if you're running to be on the state executive committee of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, those kinds of seats, those things do appear on the ballot, but those aren't public offices. They're actually party positions. And so, and a lot of times those positions are held by people who are office holders. And so that would be allowed. But Briggs says that this is not aimed at Gloria Johnson. He says that he started having conversations about this bill 3 years ago. There were concerns raised to him about a candidate in Farragut, I think, who was possibly looking to run for two offices at the same time. And so he says he's had it on the burner for a while, and he's bringing it forward now. Of course, regardless of whether, I don't see any reason to disbelieve Briggs. Briggs is generally a pretty straightforward guy. But regardless of intent, the timing of this very much makes it look like, and it's going to be perceived as, regardless of what Briggs says, it's going to be perceived as a Get Gloria bill that basically, because we all know that the Republicans in the state legislature do not like Gloria Johnson. Of course, she was one of the Tennessee Three last year who was threatened with expulsion, and she barely avoided expulsion by one vote, but essentially a majority of Republicans in the House did vote to kick her out. They don't like her. They think she's obnoxious. She's very outspoken. She calls out the Republican supermajority all the time for what she sees as their bad behavior. And she's pretty persona non grata with the Republican leadership in Nashville. And so, regardless of the specific origins and intent of the bill, the appearance of it very much is that the legislature could take advantage of the fact that she's running for Senate to say, which they don't think she's going to win, to say, see you later. Like their best case scenario at the end of all this is that Johnson loses the Senate race and they don't have to deal with her in the legislature anymore. And so the prospect of her still sticking around in the legislature, I'm sure to some Republicans, if not Briggs and Wright, some other Republicans, that sticks in their craw. And the whole question about this bill is the timing and legality of it. Briggs said from his conversations with state election officials, he thinks that if they pass the bill before April, so April 4th is the deadline to qualify for state and federal offices and get on the ballot. And so Johnson has already filed her petition for both. And her contention is that since she's already met the requirements to qualify as a candidate, that, she's essentially legally protected from anything that could happen later. But Briggs said his understanding is that if the legislature hurries up and passes this bill, which they're very capable of doing when they're motivated, before April 4th and has an effective date of it before April 4th, that could put it into effect for this year, 2024. And Briggs also said, this is something that could ultimately have to be settled by the courts. And so who knows what is going to happen here? I talked to Chris Davis at the Knox County Election Commission about how they would handle this kind of situation. And he just basically said that's not going to be his decision. Like, if she's qualified, if he hears from the state she's qualified to be on the ballot, she goes on the ballot. If he hears from the state or a judge or somebody else that she can't be on the ballot, then she won't go on the ballot. Like, that's not going to be a local Knox County Election Commission decision. But it's honestly a bit unclear. This looks like it could go in several different directions.
Yeah, it can. I talked to one Republican in a not for public, not really, so I'm not going to name who it is. Talked to one Republican who talked about Johnson and how she's perceived by Republicans in the legislature, and this Republican knows what he's speaking about, and mentioned that it's a blue district, and Seema Singh would be a good representative for them. She's at least she can get we can get along with her.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. It's not just partisan here. Yeah, it's personal.
It's personal, and and I've also talked to some people, and I know you're talking to people as well, and both Republicans and Democrats who are really puzzled by Johnson's decision.
Mm-hmm.
The most common thing that I've heard is, she needs to pick one, mm-hmm. and stick with it, and doesn't matter which one, just pick one and go. And that seems to be I'm no pollster. I haven't talked to hundreds of people, but I've talked to a lot of people who follow politics closely, and that is an emerging, I won't say consensus, but it's a very common reaction.
Yeah, I think that's true. I do also think, though, that if Johnson is able to be on the ballot for both of those offices, she would remain a very strong favorite in that district, obviously, because she's only been elected to this particular district once, because they redrew it last time mm-hmm. around in the redistricting, and actually, as we've talked about, they drew Johnson out of the district. She had to move in order to run again. Again, just the level of kind of like messing with her personally that the Republicans have done over the years. But I think that if she is legally able to be on the ballot, as much as she's certainly an underdog in the Senate race, she would be very much a favorite in the legislative race. And so if they want to keep her out of the legislature, probably this bill and the legal course that it will take is the Republicans' best option.
Yeah, and it may be, it itself, I think, may be a long shot, even if they pass it. Like you said, the timing, the questions about that, that's all up in the air. But I think that they're probably would be relying on this legislation more than a Republican candidate taking that seat from Johnson.
Right.
That's going to be that would be tough.
Yep. Well, certainly more to come there. Going to be interesting. Some other election stuff to talk about. Of course, we do have the Knox County primaries coming up here March 5th, and early voting starts this coming week, February 14th, Valentine's Day. Again, nothing says love like local politics. And we have been kind of on an ongoing basis profiling some of the contested primaries. This week we took a look at a couple of them. Scott, you wrote about the Republican property assessor's race, not an office that people typically pay a lot of attention to, except for every 4 years when you get reappraised.
It was. People were definitely paying attention a couple of years ago.
For sure. But what did you find out about Jackie Raley and Phil Ballard?
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting thing. John Whitehead is the current property assessor. He's term limited. This is his second term, so he can't serve again. The thing about the Republican primary is that both of the candidates, Jackie Raley and Phil Ballard, can say, "I've got 8 years of experience at this job." and both be true. Ballard was the property assessor for 2 terms prior to Whitehead, and also after Whitehead. Whitehead was the property assessor in the early 2000s as well. When term limits came into effect, he had to leave office in 2008.
Right. Whitehead and Ballard have kind of traded this off.
For the last 20 years. So, Ballard served for 8 years. He was term limited, so he couldn't. He served the maximum, and then he left office, and Whitehead came back in. An interesting thing, when Ballard ran for re-election in 2012, Whitehead, who had been out of office for 4 years, ran against him, and Ballard won. Then Ballard had actually hired Raley into the office, and for the last 8 years or so, she's been the chief deputy to Whitehead. So she kind of does the day-to-day management of the office.
Very involved in how the office runs.
Very involved in how the office runs, the training, all the nuts and bolts of how that office works. So both of them can say that they're very experienced, and they're running in it's probably going to be still fresh on people's minds. The last assessment, because of the housing market the way it is, the people's value, the home values and business property values too, commercial property, soared, which meant their taxes, they would pay more in taxes just because of the value of the underlying property values is higher. And so they're going to do another assessment in 2026.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever is elected to this office will have an effect on every single property owner in Knox County. Yep. I think people might be paying a little bit more attention to this race than maybe normally, because everybody kind of expects their property values to go up gradually, but the last one was a big jump for a lot of people. Anyway, both candidates are lifelong Knox County residents. Raley grew up in Fountain City. Ballard is from Carter, the Carter community. So they know a lot of people. They've been working with the public for a very long time. So it's going to be probably a very close race, because there aren't, they're both just running on, I've got experience, I'm competent, vote for me.
Which is one of the interesting things about this office. That's kind of all you can run on.
Right.
Because, there's a lot of legal restrictions on property assessment, and for good reason. You are not allowed, of course, to promise people that you're going to reduce their property value and their property taxes. The assessment is supposed to be a data-driven scientific might be pushing it, but
Yeah.
let's say
Yeah, it's
an evidence-based, fact-based process based on, other comparable sales in an area and size of properties and so on and so forth. And so even though the thing that assessors do that affects people the most is the assessment, obviously, because that determines your property taxes, you cannot run for this office promising. You can't promise to make people happy. Basically.
Oh, that's true, and both said that. Rayleigh was saying that that educating the public is something that the property assessors really need to do, because the public doesn't understand necessarily that everything is data driven. Everything is, you do have to have evidence for everything that you do. And in fact, one of the things that she said was, when you appeal, and you can appeal your assessment, and a lot of people did 2 years ago. But when you appeal, you can't just go in and say, my taxes are too high,
mm-hmm.
or you put too high a value on my house. You have to go in and you demonstrate why.
Right. You need data of your own.
You need data of your own to win that argument. So it's interesting, and it's one of those things. It's one of the things I always talk to people about when we talk about the assessments is, on the one hand, yes, you're going to end up paying more in taxes if your assessment is higher than a certain amount. We won't go into all the details right now, but if it increases by a certain amount, you will pay more in taxes. But what that means when your assessment is substantially higher is you're wealthier. Your property is worth more than it was before.
Your net worth has gone up.
Yes. So I mean, it's
if they're doing their jobs right, and the assessment really does reflect market increases in property value.
Right. And I think that's been a challenge in the recent years, because property values have gone up so much.
Yep.
But anyway, this race, the winner, this is the Republican primary, remember? So the winner will face a Democrat, Drew Harper, in the general election.
And we will be talking to Harper ahead of that. Right now, we've just been focusing on candidates with competitive primaries.
Right.
And another one that we looked at this past week was the 3rd District School Board seat, which also has a Republican primary. This one's interesting. It's currently represented by Daniel Watson, who, as we mentioned earlier, is an independent member of the school board. He initially was going to seek re-election, and he was going to run as an independent. He was one of the board members who was not happy about the shift to a partisan school board, but because of various obligations that he has, among other things, he has helped launch a new preschool that he's running. He decided not to run for re-election, leaving the seat open. And the 2 Republicans who are running are Angie Goddard and Robert Daspit. Whoever wins that primary will then face Democrat Patricia Fontenot Ridley in August in the general election. But again, we just looked at the 2 Republicans here for now. And this is an interesting duo, because Angie Goddard first became, I think, well known at least in the civic realm. I certainly first saw and heard her, and probably a lot of people did, during the pushback from a lot of Knox County parents against pandemic health restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Goddard was one of a group of parents that kind of grew over time, coming and protesting to the school board about, the mask mandate, the kinds of quarantining that people had to do during the kind of first full school year of the pandemic, the disruption of events like student concerts and graduations, all of those things. There were a lot of parents who were upset about that, and Goddard was one of them. And so she became a consistent presence at school board meetings speaking about that. One point that she made to me in talking about this was because, some of those meetings, as people may remember, got pretty heated, and there was some pretty heated rhetoric, but elevated tones of voice and all of that. Goddard said, she was not one of those. She was not somebody who came and yelled at people. That's not how she thinks you should do things. Her point was just to raise concerns and speak up on behalf of parents and students who were being negatively impacted by the pandemic restrictions. She also, during that time, became the founding chair of the local chapter of Moms for Liberty, which is a conservative activist group. We've talked about them here before. They've made a lot of headlines around the country in the last several years. They were originally formed in Florida, and they have become really associated in people's minds with efforts to ban and restrict books from school libraries and certain kinds of educational materials around race and gender and sexuality. And they very much become part of the, at a national level, they've become part of the kind of like conservative political apparatus. And a lot of national Republicans have talked about the value of Moms for Liberty as sort of like a conservative political action group in a lot of ways at the grassroots level, getting parents fired up around conservative priorities. Goddard said that her association with the group really specifically had to do with her objections to the pandemic restrictions, and that as those went away, ultimately with the final mask mandate being lifted in a court settlement a couple of years ago, she herself kind of drifted away from Moms for Liberty. And she said she hasn't been associated with them for the last 2 years. And so whatever people think about Moms for Liberty, pro or con, Goddard is kind of deliberately saying, regardless of your opinions of Moms for Liberty, like, that's not me right now. I'm not affiliated. And the local chapter has gotten reorganized, and they have new leadership. They have been showing up at some school board meetings, advocating for things, including restrictions on material in school libraries and so forth. Interesting thing is, they turned around this week and endorsed Robert Daspit, the candidate who's running against Goddard. Now, Daspit's an interesting guy. He is retired after years in medical sales, but he's also an Air Force veteran, and he's also, over the course of many years, been a teacher, a certified teacher in a couple of states, including in Tennessee. After he retired from his medical sales career, he decided to, decided he was a little bored, needed to get out of the house, and he went back and got his. He had been certified to teach in other states, but he's from Louisiana originally. He got certified to teach here in Tennessee, and so he has taught in some Tennessee schools in Smith County, in Knox County. He's been a substitute, and so he's bringing what he says is a teacher's perspective, and he thinks the board needs to have more people with teaching experience on it, but a teaching perspective from also a very conservative Republican point of view. And so on the one hand, he says that teachers need to be paid more, not just teachers, but custodians, everybody up and down the staff roster in Knox County schools, he thinks need to be paid more, but he's very strongly opposed to any tax increase to provide resources for that. He says he thinks the school budget is big enough as it is, but that it needs to be prioritized better, which, to be fair, is one of those things that people who are not currently in office and are running for office tend to say, that basically once they get in there, they're going to find all of the fat or misdirected priorities, and there will be plenty of money there. Often that doesn't turn out to quite be true, but of course, it's easy to say kind of when you're on the outside of a system. But he is presenting himself as somebody who has both experience within the system and experience outside the system as a parent and his kids went to Knox County schools. His grandson's at Bearden High School right now. He's very involved with school athletics. So, he's kind of presenting himself as a straight-talking, no-nonsense guy who's going to come in there with, primary concerns for teachers and staff and so forth, but also making sure that the district is responsive to the concerns of parents like Moms for Liberty. He said he shares a lot of Moms for Liberty's concerns about material in school libraries and so forth, which is obviously why they endorsed him. Goddard, meanwhile, is not endorsed by Moms for Liberty, but she does have support from really the Republican establishment. Several members of the Haslam family are supporting her. Former school board member Doug Harris is supporting her. Scott Henderson, who is the husband of Betsy Henderson, who is the chair of the school board, donated to her. So, that's not Betsy Henderson donating directly herself, but the Henderson household is supporting Goddard. And so even though she kind of started a couple of years ago as sort of this outsider activist, Moms for Liberty organizer, she now in this election is running as kind of the establishment Republican candidate, and Moms for Liberty has endorsed her opponent.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit. It's not the exact same situation, but Seema Singh, who we spoke of earlier, something similar with her. She got her start in elected politics by being a candidate of the city council movement, which is a progressive grassroots organization that also backed Amelia Parker, who's now on council as well. But once Singh was elected to her position 5 years ago, she got estranged from, kind of did the same thing, kind of distanced herself from the city council movement, and they distanced themselves from her. So that it's kind of a similar
and
situation
city council movement.
there.
They did not support Singh in her second run, right, when she ran for re-election. And these things happen, and it's interesting to watch. I think you and I have both seen this many times. People who kind of start as outside activists, and the first time you see them, they're showing up, kind of railing against the people who are in office and in power and whatever over whatever issues they're fired up about. And some of them remain in that position. We have activists, both liberal and conservative activists, left and right activists here in Knox County, who both of us have been seeing at local meetings for years and years, kind of continuing to play that activist role. Mm-hmm. But then there are other people who move beyond that into running for office and then getting elected to office. And then suddenly the people who kind of started as insurgents are now, in a certain literal way, part of the establishment. And some of their old colleagues who remain on sort of the insurgent side start to view them with the same skepticism that they're viewing everybody else sitting up there on the dais. Yeah,
one thing, and you mentioned this a minute ago, is it's easy from the outside to see flaws, but when you get on the inside, you start really looking at how things operate. You realize that it's harder to fix than you might think. But there are regulations that you've got to follow that people don't really talk about or know about. From that. We talked a little bit about this last week when we were talking about the Volunteer Ministry Center walking away from operating the foyer. I mean, basically, they're a subrecipient of a HUD grant, and there are things you've got to do to get a HUD grant, and so it's not just as easy as saying, "Oh, well, somebody will take the money and do this." No, you've got to. There are hoops you got to jump through,
and the political dynamics too of. It's not just having to satisfy your own base of like activist supporters. If you want to actually get things done, you have to build support from other elected office holders, whether that's fellow members of a city council or school board or a mayor or state legislators or whatever. Yeah. But it's kind of like getting elected is sort of the first step toward being able to change things. But it's only the first step.
Yeah. In and of itself, it isn't going to change things. You can, unless you get other people to join you, or and a lot of times that takes compromise.
Yep.
And so if you're the type who doesn't compromise, like you said, the base might like it, but you won't get anything done. But if you do compromise and get things done, your old friends might not like it so much.
Right. Exactly. Yep. We see this over and over. And if Goddard ends up being elected to the school board, it'll be interesting to see how, she kind of makes that journey from outside to inside. Of course, even if she wins the primary, as I said, she does still have a Democratic opponent. That district, the 3rd district, somewhat politically mixed. The most recent indicator we had there was a county commission race 2 years ago that was actually quite close. Gina Oster, Republican, won, but Stuart Hall ran a very good and strong campaign there. It's definitely does not appear to be a district that the Republican Party can take for granted. And so we will be talking more about the dynamics of that race as we approach the general election in August. But for now, if you want to know about the primary contest, you can find that on our website. Okay, let's take a quick break and come back with our Q&A. Okay, our Q&A of the week has to do with the Knox County Sheriff's Office and an incident at a Starbucks coffee location. Every week we go on to our subscriber-only Facebook group, the Compass Colloquy, and we ask our readers if they have any particular issues beyond the obvious headlines that they would like to hear about on the podcast. And somebody asked about this incident and whether we had looked into it. And so to answer that question directly, no, this isn't something that we have done reporting on. But Angela Dennis at the News Sentinel has written some very good stories on it, which you can find online. And just to clarify, the fact that we haven't reported on it doesn't mean that we don't think it's an important story. It's just that, of course, we can only cover so much. There's 2 of us. Everything we've been talking about this week, we cover a lot of things. And so particularly an enterprise story like this, where another outlet has put a lot of reporting work into it and done a lot of the groundwork, where it would take us probably a lot of time and effort to go out and duplicate all of that. More often what we will do is, link to these stories or talk about them on the podcast, just to make sure that our readers know that this reporting has been done and this incident is out there. But the reason I want to talk about this alleged situation is that it ties into some things that we've talked about before about accountability in the sheriff's office, which also came up at a county commission candidate forum just a couple of weeks ago. So Angela Dennis's reporting on this is based around interviews with a gentleman who is manager at the Starbucks store at Cedar Bluff. And apparently what happened there was a phone call. The sheriff's office responded to a domestic disturbance call there, but the domestic disturbance hadn't happened at Starbucks. Somebody who was at the Starbucks called 911 and reported that they had been assaulted by their I don't know if it was their spouse or domestic partner or whatever, and that they had fled the house and was kind of hiding out, I guess, at Starbucks, but was afraid that their partner, the woman, was going to come after them with a gun. And so that's why the sheriffs responded. They got to the Starbucks and apparently, again, according to the reporting, pulled in and blocked the drive-through. Their cars were parked in a way that they were disrupting the flow of business there. Anybody familiar with Starbucks drive-throughs all over town knows that they tend to be, the cars will back up and wrap around the building and everything. So disrupting that obviously is disruptive to the business. So The manager came out to talk to the deputies, and remember, again, none of this call had anything to do with the manager or with Starbucks itself. The person just happened to be there. But the manager came out to kind of see what was going on and see if there was any way to not block the flow of business while they were conducting what they were conducting. One thing led to another, and this is where it gets murky. We don't know exactly what happened. But basically, he says that the officers were very aggressive with him as he was just asking questions, and very quickly, he ended up being, he says, assaulted, pushed to the ground. There are photos of him showing a cut on his forehead, and then he was arrested. Basically, he was charged with some misdemeanors, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, that kind of thing. Those charges ended up getting dismissed rather quickly, like last November. But an important part of this is that the gentleman in question, the Starbucks manager, was black. And, of course, any kind of interactions between law enforcement and black residents, especially situations where it seems a little bit dubious whether somebody should have even been charged in the first place, like those are going to draw a lot of attention. And he basically feels like, and the reason he's talked to the News Sentinel about this is that, he wants there to be some accountability for law enforcement, that you can't just kind of show up, push people around, and yet, he's legally free and clear now. The DA's office, after reviewing body camera footage, dismissed the charges. But the sheriff's office so far has refused to release that body camera footage, even though it ought to be public record at this point because the case is dismissed. A lot of times they won't release footage while a criminal case is still underway, but the criminal case is not still underway. Again, its charges have been dismissed, but they have refused to release the footage and also have refused to answer questions from the News Sentinel about the incident, just basically stonewalled them entirely. And the Starbucks manager says that he's not seeking money. He's not trying to get something from this except some accountability from public employees paid with public tax dollars who came to his place of business. And he says, essentially assaulted him and arrested him for no good reason. That was not their goal in coming there, was to investigate the manager of Starbucks. But he's the guy they ended up arresting. And, obviously, we will see what comes of this. Maybe they will release the footage at some point. Maybe there will be a lawsuit. Who knows what's going to happen? It's certainly an interesting incident that raises a lot of questions. But it also ties into something we have talked about here before, which is the, institutional lack of accountability for the sheriff's office. In Knox County, our sheriff is independently, and in all counties in the state, the sheriff is an independently elected office, runs the jail, and provides law enforcement services. And in Knox County, there is no outside authority or accountability for the sheriff's office, except for, if somebody commits a crime, if somebody is a corrupt police officer or, commits an assault at a level that does cross into criminal behavior, they can be charged by the DA's office, by, the Department of Justice, whatever. So there is a level of criminal accountability. But a lot of things that bother people about their interactions with law enforcement do not typically rise to the level of criminality. It's, this officer was a jerk to me, or in this case, these officers for no good reason, he says manhandled him and assaulted him. The DA's office also did not bring any charges, of course, against the officers involved here. But, in the city of Knoxville, there is the Police Advisory Review Committee, which there are a lot of activists who, don't think it has enough power or goes far enough in holding police accountable. But it is at least a venue and an avenue for people who have complaints or concerns about the police department to go to and have their concern heard and looked at and possibly remediated in one way or another. And it is an independent body. It's not part of the police department. It's a separate city office created by ordinance. There is nothing like that for the sheriff's office. And of course, in the city, the police chief also has a level of accountability because the police chief answers to the mayor. In the county, the sheriff doesn't answer to anybody. And the standard line on accountability for the sheriff's office has been, well, you have accountability every 4 years when
every election
on the ballot, which is true at a certain level. But, if you have a specific, in this case, Tom Spangler, the current sheriff, is term limited. So, what is the accountability? If your whole argument is that, well, sheriffs are accountable at the ballot box and we have term limits, the entire second term of a sheriff's time in office, what are you saying the accountability is? Functionally, there's none. There is not an accountability mechanism. And so there was a forum with some of the county commission candidates a couple of weeks ago, and one of the questions that got asked there was, would you support some kind of civilian review or oversight for the sheriff's office? And there were a range of answers. In general, most but not all of the Republican candidates kind of hedged and kind of said that, they think things are working pretty well. They talked much more about how they support the police than about any kind of holding them accountable. And a couple of candidates did actually use that line about how, well, there's accountability at the ballot box. Most of the Democratic candidates running and some of the Republicans did say, I don't think the sheriff's office should be afraid of having some kind of outside review, and that people in the community who have concerns ought to have a place that they can go to have them heard. So there was some openness to that, but, honestly, it feels like a long shot that, because something like that would have to be established by county commission. County commission, of course, is strongly Republican, has typically been populated by people who are strong supporters of the sheriff's office, although that has varied over the years. We've had some high-profile Republicans in years gone by who waged fairly significant battles with the sheriff's office over various things. But in the current political climate, Scott, it seems to me a little bit unlikely that the county, that we would see something like that come through county commission. Probably you would have to have maybe a much more egregious situation than this one, or a series of situations before you would start to see real movement there. Yeah,
and it could even require state action rather than there is a state law that governs the city police department committees like Park, and one thing so there might have to be that because the office of the sheriff is completely separate and not accountable to anybody. How can something that created by a county commission have any say? I mean, they can, the sheriff can just say, "No, I'm not giving you anything."
Right.
And and given the political climate too, just locally, I don't. It would have a tough going to even get started, much less can you finish it or not. So, and even so, like the city's review board, they really, and this kind of goes to what the sheriff can just go, sure, why not? Because they don't really have any teeth. I mean, they can't compel the Knoxville Police Department to do anything.
Right. They can't discipline officers themselves or anything like that. Right. They can make recommendations.
They can make recommendations. They can certainly highlight any wrongdoing on the part of officers, and do from time to time. And but as far as actually being able to sanction the police department, they can't, and the same would be true of any kind of civilian oversight of the sheriff's office.
Yeah, the thing I think it does provide, even if it is partly symbolic maybe, but it does provide a place. So if you feel badly treated by the Knoxville Police Department, and you want to go and talk to somebody about that who is not the Knoxville Police Department, because of course you can't always complain directly to the department, and people do, but you have a separate place where you can go, you can file that complaint. Somebody who is not part of the police department will at least, look at it, or will talk to the police department about it. But you feel there's and then Park itself has public meetings where people can come and speak as well. And so you feel like at least there's a place you can go where somebody will hear you, somebody will, take you seriously enough to at least listen to the complaint and maybe review it and so forth. And with the sheriff's office, like, we just don't have that. We do, and I know I've said this several times on the podcast, but I think it's important for people to be aware of sort of like the environment, the political and legal environment you live in. And in Knox County, if you are treated abusively by a sheriff's deputy, and like, let's be honest here, this happens. We all know law enforcement officers can treat people badly. It happens so regularly that you can't say that it's just like, oh, it only happens once every 10 years. Like, that's just not true. Like, we know there are people who have bad encounters with law enforcement on a fairly regular basis. Maybe the cop's just in a bad mood. Like, who knows? Maybe the person's being a jerk, and that's why the cop is a jerk back to them. There's all sorts of things that can happen. But these are often very high-stress situations, and under stress, everybody, including law enforcement officers, can behave badly. So I'm just going to assert out there that this happens. It's not a hypothetical. People suffer unpleasant encounters with local law enforcement. If that happens to you with the sheriff's office, you can't do anything unless you want to allege that they broke some law or something. You want to try to get some major, lawsuit or investigation or something. But if it's something where you're just like, this person was unnecessarily rude or rough or whatever else with me, you can complain to the sheriff's office. That's the place you complain to. There's no other place you can go. And that's the world we live in. So it's just good to know. If you have something bad happen to you, if your cousin or brother or anybody else has something bad happen to you with the sheriff's office, law enforcement at that level just has a tremendous amount of immunity and impunity. And never mind that, yes, you're paying their salaries. Yes, they are theoretically public servants who work for you and blah, blah, blah. You can't do anything about it.
Yeah, it's that is a key difference between the city and the county. And the city, you do at least have that forum, and people do use it to complain about rude behavior. And
I think rude behavior is the most common complaint.
I was about to say that it is the most common complaint, and things like that. You can, if nothing else, get it off your chest and get it in public, and
you can get it on the record, and that way, now theoretically, of course, this depends on the law enforcement agency following through, but one would think that if you're the Knoxville Police Department, if you're a supervisor and you have an officer who's had, 8 or 9 rudeness complaints in a short period of time, like, you might do something about it. Yeah. You might at least look at it and say, hey, what's going on? Do we need to do some remediation here or something? And just no indication of anything like that from the sheriff's office. Scott and I have both been reporters in Knoxville going back to the 1990s, and the Knox County Sheriff's Office has just continually, it's not that people haven't raised concerns about all sorts of things that the sheriff's office has done over that time, but they are, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, the Knox County Sheriff's Office is the single most, of all of our local elected public institutions, it is the single most resistant to outside accountability of any institution that we have. And so that might not make you feel good, but it's the reality. And in regard, and this Starbucks situation is just one more case we're seeing of exactly this. And I'm not saying, I don't know that the officers did anything wrong. I do know that they arrested a guy who was not even the subject of the complaint and who all charges were then dismissed again. So that in and of itself certainly raises some questions. But the fact that the sheriff's office's response to this kind of thing is just to basically, stiff arm any efforts by either the public or the media to get information, to ask questions, to get even an internal review of it. That's just standard operating procedure for the sheriff's office. Okay, let's look ahead to the coming week. We do have some things on the agenda. Tuesday night, the 13th, at Messiah Lutheran Church on Kingston Pike, there will be another county commission candidate forum. And so this will cover there are so many candidates and so many seats up in this election that they have, the League of Women Voters that organizes these forums broke them up into two forums. And so we had one forum a couple of weeks ago. This is the second county commission forum, and this is going to cover districts 4, 5, and 9. And so all of the county commission candidates running for those seats have been invited. I'm going to be moderating it. Come on out and join us. And the League of Women Voters will also be live streaming that. That is going to run from 6:30 to 8 p.m. on Tuesday. And that is a great way to get yourself ready for what happens on Wednesday, which is
early voting begins.
Early voting begins on Wednesday, February 14th. It runs through February 27th. And this is for all of those county primaries as well as the presidential primary. Super Tuesday, March 5th is the date of the primary, but we do have a couple of weeks of early voting starting up here. So again, you can find all of our election coverage, and we're still going to be writing about, because there's so many races on the ballot.
We haven't been able to get to them all yet.
Even as early voting starts, we're still going to be. We have a couple more of those to come in the coming weeks. So that is the election stuff on the agenda this week. And then, Scott, a couple of city events later in the week.
Yeah, on Thursday, City Council is holding a work session, and they're holding that. That's going to be where Mayor Indya Kincannon's administration presents her comprehensive housing plan. We've talked about that before. A lot of it is already out there and known and even in place, but this is going to be kind of pulling it all together, presenting it to City Council, getting them to, allowing them to ask questions, and some things will have to be, they'll have to pass resolutions or ordinances to get some of these things done. They already did with the middle housing portion of the plan. Other aspects moving forward, they'll be that may require City Council action. So, but I think most importantly, this brings, because housing and the supply and demand imbalance and the need for more affordable housing, all those things, it's such a big issue, and the city has various programs, but this pulls them all together in a package to say, see, this program does this program does that, this other program does the other thing, and so it's a very a very good opportunity to kind of learn what they're doing, what they're proposing doing, and then bring up council members can bring up questions about what they think is lacking at that point. Then the next day, on Friday, the city's holding its annual budget retreat, and this is where the administration talks about the year-to-date performance of the city's budget, where they, kind of where the city stands with tax revenues and expenditures. For example, there was, we just reported about the city's added expenditures related to the snowstorm. But they're going to talk about that in preparation. This is kind of the first public meeting about the budget for next year. This kind of lays the groundwork for budget discussions over the next couple of months. So anyway, that's going to be that one is going to be Friday morning at the public service complex
on Morris Avenue.
On Morris Avenue, right off Middlebrook Pike. So.
Right. Well, we will be back here next week to talk about all of those things and anything else that happens in the interim. Thanks, as always, to Seth Barber, Lord Seth Barber, for his production work here with Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright. And we will talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.